Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to Forbes Library Coolidge Museum. My name is Betty Sharp. I'm co-director of Historic Northampton, and we are here to hear Danielle Raad talk about her new book, Above the Oxbow, Stories Entangled with a Mountain. And I think that is the most intriguing title, and I'm pretty excited about this. So welcome to everyone who's on YouTube as well. A few housekeeping announcements before we get started. Bathrooms are out there and to your left, out the door. And that's an emergency exit, and that is also an emergency exit. So Julie, I'm going to see if we can find a way so that the emergency exit isn't blocked. That we are happy to collaborate with Forbes, and we've done this quite often. And our exhibit, which is down at Historic Northampton, which is called Slavery and Freedom, 1654 to 1783. And we have done a lot of work with Forbes Library in conjunction with that. Please come see it. It's up until December 11th. Please silence your cell phones if you haven't already. This program is free, but we welcome donations to defray the cost. And the donation basket is over there, so please take a spin by it when you are when you're leaving. And today's presentation is, and I'm going to introduce Danielle Raad. I'm thrilled to have her here. She's presently Assistant Professor of History and Museum Studies at the University of Georgia. She earned her PhD in anthropology and a graduate certificate in public history from UMass, and in 2021. She previously held positions as curator and assistant director of collections of the Stanford University Archaeology Collections and the Coleman Payson Fellowship in Academic Affairs and Outreach at the Yale University Art Gallery. And I learned something equally interesting, which is that she is from Eastern Massachusetts, and for a time before she did all these things, she taught physics in high school in Cambridge and Arlington. How about that? So welcome, Danielle.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much, Betty. Thanks to everyone for being here today. Thank you to Historic Northampton, Laurie Sanders and Betty Sharp for hosting me, co-sponsoring this event, and for the Forbes Library and Calvin Coolidge Museum, where we are, for hosting me as well. And also thank you to Broadside Books, who are on site selling copies of the book, so consider picking up your copy afterwards. I'll also be signing some copies. So I'm really excited to be here today. This is the last event that I'm doing in a little book tour, coming back to Western Mass to share the book out with people. It was published in early April 2026, so less than a month ago, by West Virginia University Press. And my plan for today is to give you an overview of the book, but to also emphasize in particular parts of it that relate to engaging with the past on Mount Holyoke. So before I really kind of launch into it, I want to take you up Mount Holyoke with me. So I guess to show of hands, how many of you have been up Mount Holyoke? Just getting a sense. Okay, great, thank you. And I think we've all seen it as well. I think I saw it on my way walking over here from the hotel I'm staying at. But I want to take you up the mountain. These are some photos I just took yesterday. Luckily, we had a bit of a break from the rain, so I was able to hike up there in my visit here. So we could park at the mountainside trailhead. We might take a look at the kiosk and see if there's any notices up that we need to be aware of. We'll set off down the gravel trail and start making our way up, following some of the signs. We might end up with a fork in the trail and come up and approach the sign and decide on which way to the Summit House we're going to go, maybe the Taylor Notch Trail or the Halfway House Trail. Either of them could get you up to the summit in about a mile. So maybe let's go to the right and take the Halfway House Trail up. We'll walk along some wooden planks, get to a part in the trail where someone has cut a tree that has fallen over. We'll eventually get to the halfway area where we can get our first glimpse of the summit house up at the summit, the white structure peeking through the trees, and we can see a structure covering the remains of the engine that used to power the tramway. But let's go around and keep ascending on this steep trail. We'll look for the blazes, the painted swaths of paint on the trees to help guide our way up. We will keep climbing until we get another glimpse of the summit house. And we can turn to the side and notice that there's a road going up, so we might think at this point we could have just driven. Except the road doesn't actually open yet, so that wouldn't have been possible. We'll come closer to the summit house, which looks like it has a very fresh coat of paint. We'll turn around and look out at the view for the first time. We'll notice the Connecticut River and the Oxbow, and kind of take in the rest of this expanse, and then climb up onto the deck of the summit house and maybe do a lap, as I like to do, looking out, trying to maybe find Northampton across the river, peeking in through the windows of the summit house since it's not yet open for the season, but we can look in and find maybe old fire extinguisher and the arm that used to hold a telescope. We might look in another window and see a little exhibit case and a square piano. And then we might keep walking down and look out at the river, try to find, if you're with me, I'll try to point out UMass to you. And then maybe we will sit and have a picnic. So I wanted to start off by bringing you up the mountain with me. As many of you know, Mount Holyoke straddles the town lines of Hadley and South Hadley, Massachusetts. It is in the Joseph Allen Skinner State Park, which is managed by Mass DCR, the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. It is the westernmost peak of the Mount Holyoke Range, and actually the rest of the range is in the separate but adjacent Mount Holyoke Range State Park. So it is two separate parks. Here's a satellite image that shows the Mount Holyoke Range, the sinuous Connecticut River with its distinctive oxbow, which was cut off from the flow of the river a century ago in 1840. You can also see the city of Northampton, where we are now, at top left, Interstate 91 that cuts over the oxbow on the west side of the river. And Mount Holyoke is located on the traditional homelands of the Nonotuck, one of the many indigenous groups of the Kunitzikyu, or Connecticut River Valley. The homelands of the Pecumtuck and Abenaki lie to the north, the Nipmuc to the east, and the Agawam to the south. And this region is at a crossroads of native nations, home to indigenous peoples for millennia before Europeans arrived in the 1630s. And the range goes into the southern part of Amherst, and as I mentioned, you can see UMass from the summit of Mount Holyoke. And I started this project as a PhD student in the anthropology department at UMass, so I would often look at campus when I went up there, taking a little bit of a respite from being on campus and my coursework. And Mount Holyoke is a place where we can experience a really strong sense of space, a geographic awareness from the summit. So we can go up there and look out at the valley, look for Northampton, and kind of see where we are in the valley. And so Mount Holyoke is renowned for its great views. We can see about 80 miles of the Connecticut River Valley on clear days from Vermont to Connecticut. And it's been attracting visitors to its summit for centuries. The earliest written account I found of someone going up to the summit for recreation to enjoy the view dates back to 1760. Reverend Paul Coffin published his memoirs in 1760 and wrote of Mount Holyoke, quote, "The view here far exceeds all I ever had before." The first cabin structure on the summit, which offered some basic amenities, was built in 1821, and in 1851, a larger structure was built as a hotel. The 1851 Summit House structure is what still stands today, and it is operated by the state as a seasonal historic house museum open on weekends during the summer season. Mount Holyoke has captivated many artists, poets, and writers over the past 2 centuries. Several significant cultural works from the 19th century depict the view from Mount Holyoke, like Thomas Cole's 1836 painting, The Oxbow. And the hotel I'm staying at during this trip actually has a large print of this painting in the lobby, as I was excited to see when I walked in. It felt very appropriate for this trip. Cole's Oxbow is a touchstone of American landscape painting, and so much has been written about it, but relatively little about the mountain upon which it was sketched. Yet Mount Holyoke's presence soars over the lives of people dwelling in the Connecticut River Valley. In a 2005 documentary about the Mount Holyoke Range, a local professor of geology is quoted saying, "It's our landscape, it's our setting, it's the background for our lives." The Mount Holyoke Range forms both a physical and metaphorical background for the lives of people in the region. Someone else I interviewed said, "The mountains are a source of strength to all of us. They've been part of our culture. And wherever you are, you can turn around and find the mountain. It's always there for us." And I myself felt a pull to Mount Holyoke soon after moving to the area. I enjoyed hiking on the trails, looking at the views from the summit, and visiting the summit house, and quickly realized how cherished the mountain is for these and more reasons. I spoke with many people who got married up there, someone who scattered her parents' ashes there, who's actually in the audience, and two of my friends even got engaged there while I was doing this study. Mount Holyoke plays a very active role in the lives of people in the valley. Sylvia Plath, who was a student at nearby Smith College, penned a poem in 1958 about Mount Holyoke and the summit house called Above the Oxbow. The title of my book is borrowed from her poem of the same name, which has been a source of inspiration for me during my research and writing. So Plath writes, "A peculiar logic in going up for the coming down if the post we start at's the same post we finish by, but it's the clear conversion at the top can hold us to the oblique road." So when climbing a mountain, one often goes up only to go back down, finishing at our starting point, maybe where we parked our car. However, a conversion may happen along the way for some people. A transformation occurs while on the mountain. What is the nature of this conversion that many feel on Mount Holyoke? What holds us to the oblique road to the side of the mountain, and what connects us to this mountain? Mount Holyoke is a multifaceted place. It is a geological feature, a state park, a historic landscape, a complex ecosystem of flora and fauna, and a site of both environmental conservation and historic preservation advocacy. My book, Above the Oxbow, is a multi-stranded story of place that considers community activism, the creation and propagation of historical narratives and visions of the landscape, and engagements with physical materials and the more than human environment, like plants and animals. And so these are the research questions I formulated when starting out this project. I wanted to learn what is the nature of people's attachment to Mount Holyoke, what has made this mountain so special to people in the valley, and how do senses of space and sense of history contribute to place attachment. So the sense of space being this geographic awareness, sense of history being how we understand history and see ourselves in the story of a place. How do those intertwine to characterize place attachment, or people's attachment to the mountain? So with its iconic sweeping views of the Connecticut River Valley and this 200-year-old summit house, Mount Holyoke represents this convergence of environmental and historic consciousness, which then inform a sense of place. So that's what I sought to characterize through my research. So this is the table of contents of my book. So inspired by Sylvia Plath, I framed my introduction as an ascent, similar to the one I took you on at the beginning of this talk. And the coda, which we'll get to at the end, is the descent. So the going up for the coming down, and maybe ending where we started, but learning something new along the way. And then I want to speak a little bit about the cover art of the book, since it is a representation of how I've been thinking about this concept of entangled storylines. Like the subtitle of the book is Stories Entangled with a Mountain. So I was thinking about narrative threads that I was following in the work. So the book is not organized chronologically. It kind of doesn't go through just like a linear timeline. I organized the core chapters of the book according to different themes, and then I trace those themes and sort of loop around different timelines, kind of quoting people in the present and then going back into the past and pulling from an archive of around 200 years of memoirs, guidebooks, people writing about the mountain, but also people in the present. So I did a lot of interviews and tried to get to know what Mount Holyoke means to people. And so I see this sort of tangle of threads and stories as a generative space from which to tell the story of the mountain. And so what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time talking about some of the content of Chapter 2, which is the background, and then go through the other chapters and kind of share like the main themes and points of each chapter. So Chapter 2 is called Narrating the Mountain's Past. A narrative is one story among many. Any one narrative of place amplifies some voices and memories over others. A 1977 historic and economic assessment of Mount Holyoke, prepared for the state, for example, describes the Summit House as a mere box to contain the warmth and activity of 19th century life. The report goes on to mention our Victorian forefathers vacationing far above the world's cares. This is a photograph from historic Northampton showing some folks at the Mount Holyoke Summit House in around 1880s with one of the early proprietors, the second from left, Fanny French, who I'll mention more in a second. But this description encapsulates the lived experience of a narrow slice of 19th century life. Those privileged enough to visit the hotel as guests, so affluent white visitors with enough capital and free time to make the trip. So this narrative excludes those who could not patronize the hotel, those who built and maintained the structure, those who worked there. And this story could be alienating for some of us in the present, visiting the Summit House, which is now a museum, maybe even those from immigrant families who were not in the country in the 19th century. So when I outline the history of Mount Holyoke, it is not to cement this one dominant narrative, but to explore how groups in the present understand, amplify, or sometimes even push back against this history. So the so-called golden years of the Summit House were between 1850 and 1905, and almost all of the archival images I'm showing you come from this period. John French, who's pictured in the green stereo view card, someone labeled that in pen at some point. He's holding the telescope. He bought the mountain and replaced the original rustic cabin with the hotel in 1851. He also outfitted it with a tramway, which lifted people from halfway up the mountain right into the lobby of the hotel. French devised a creative way to order supplies from a store in downtown Northampton. To signal the need to relay a message, he would first send flashes of light using a reflecting glass. A shopkeeper downtown would be aware of the approximate time of the signal. He would look out for it. He would be ready with a telescope. He would look through the telescope, and he would see French at the Summit House. He would have a big board with letters on it. He would point at the letters and spell out what he wanted to order. And then I also read another account where someone would use John French's telescope to look in Northampton and see if his staff was working at the time. So visitors came from Northampton, from Boston, and even from Europe to spend a summer relaxing on the summit, taking in the view, making art, and even bowling. There was a bowling alley at some point outside. In 1871, John Dwight, a successful entrepreneur of household cleaning products, purchased the Summit House from the Frenches. He's pictured in the photo with John Dwight. And although Dwight had been, with John French, they're both named John. Although John Dwight had been residing in New York City for many years, he had roots in South Hadley and maintained strong ties to his hometown. The terms of the sale permitted John and Fanny French to remain living on the mountain and oversee the hotel's operations. They installed telephone service in 1877, which replaced French's creative visual communication system. John French passed away in 1891, leaving his widow Fanny to manage the hotel on her own. At that point, she had called the mountain home for about 40 years, exactly 40 years. In 1894, John Dwight added an expensive, luxurious addition to the Summit House, which you can see in this postcard. He constructed a 4-story east facade, significantly increasing the number of guest rooms. Fanny French passed away in 1899, and her grandson took over management until the expanded hotel, until the owner, John Dwight, passed away in 1903. And soon after Dwight's passing, a group of local residents who were invested in caring for and operating the hotel formed the Mount Holyoke Company. The creation of the Mount Holyoke Company in 1908, so a few years later, is the first instance of a concerted community effort to preserve not only the land on the mountain, but the Summit House structure. The group attempted to sell the mountain to the state in 1916 with no success. So it was this kind of nonprofit organization that formed to try to kind of collectively own the mountain and figure out what to do with it. But after the attempt to convert it into public land failed, the president of the Mount Holyoke Company, Joseph Allen Skinner, bought enough stock in the company to become the sole owner of the mountain. He kind of took that on, including the hotel. He was really invested in the preservation and enhancement of the site, both the land and the structures. He electrified the hotel and the tramway, and he widened the road to the summit to accommodate automobiles. All while making improvements through the 1930s, Skinner kept trying to sell the mountain to the state. They did not want to maintain a hotel of 40 guest rooms. It was not in the vision of the state park system to maintain a luxury hotel. He kept trying to sell it. He kept bringing the price down. Eventually, the Great New England Hurricane of 1938 hit. By that point, visitorship had declined significantly with the rise of personal vehicles, making it easy to just come up and down on a day trip, and an impending war. A mountaintop hotel was not really in high demand. But the hurricane in 1938, one of the most destructive hurricanes ever recorded, destroyed the fancy addition completely, but left the 1851 structure minimally affected. And this kind of was a bit convenient because the state said that if you bring it down to the original size, we might be interested. So the hurricane did that. But they still didn't want to buy it, so in 1940, Skinner gave up and he just donated it all to the state. He really wanted to get rid of it and preserve it as public land. He had one stipulation, that it be named after him. So that's how we get the Joseph Allen Skinner State Park, which still is today. Although finally part of a public park, the confluence of the state's general lack of interest in maintaining a hotel in one of their parks with the onset of World War II resulted in the closure of the Summit House and an extended period of neglect. So it's at this point in 1940, when the Summit House enters a state of decay, that the structure becomes a locus of engagement with the past. So I see this as a transition point, a moment when visitors to Mount Holyoke begin to interact with it as a historic and even archaeological site, rather than a contemporary business. And so this is where the chapter narrating the mountain's past concludes, and I sort of move into different stories kind of extending from the 1940s and even looping back earlier to the present day. So I'm going to give an overview of my 4 thematic chapters now. Chapter 3 is called Is Not the Scene Magnificent? The View from Mount Holyoke. And this chapter is about the landscape, the view from the summit. So pretty much everyone I talk to talks about the view from Mount Holyoke. Timothy Dwight, who is not related to John Dwight, wrote an influential memoir and guidebook, and in 1823, and he said that from Mount Holyoke is seen the richest prospect in New England and not improbably in the United States. So he's saying this is the best view in the country. And this gets repeated, his quote gets repeated, you might say plagiarized in different guidebooks over time. And it is just kind of thought of as like the most iconic, the best view. And so I wanted to know, like, why is that? What is it about the view that makes it perceived as being so iconic? And so I combed through memoirs, letters, guidebooks, and my own interviews, so 200 years of comments about the view, and I was able to distill it down into 4 components of the view that pretty much everyone talks about. And this vision is one of a landscape of Arcadia, so an idealized scene of pastoral harmony, a vision of a simple, quiet life where farmland seamlessly integrates with nature. Augustus Silliman, who also had ties to Yale, I don't know if I mentioned that the Dwight, who made the previous quote, was actually the president of Yale College. Another person that had strong ties to Yale wrote a book called A Gallop Among American Scenery, and he has an entry for Mount Holyoke. This was published in 1881, and so I want to quote Augustus Silliman as I introduce to you the 4 components of the view that people talk about. So Silliman wrote, "See, at the base of the mountain curls like a great serpent the Connecticut. See the beautiful plains, the prairies beneath us, one great carpet of cultivation. While the villages in glistening whiteness are scattered in every part of the landscape, and far in the distance, rising in majesty, the mountains." So these are the four parts of the view: the Connecticut River and its oxbow, farmland and meadows, towns like Northampton and church spires, and then the mountains in the distance bounding it all that people talk about, the four kind of components that make up this landscape of Arcadia. And so conclusions of this chapter are that this landscape viewed from Mount Holyoke is a vision of an unchanging Arcadia that was constructed by 19th century social elites and is perpetuated and reinforced today as the dominant way of seeing the landscape. And so this has led to things like the highway, power lines, UMass, buildings of UMass being seen as not part of the view. Sometimes they're just not even acknowledged at all, and when they are, people talk about them as like, oh, they're intrusions. They're not part of the view. They're just intrusions into the view. Particularly the tall buildings of UMass built in the 60s and 70s, and they're still going. It's like, okay, that is an interruption, but this is what the view is. And so to conclude in this chapter, I was showing the Thomas Cole painting again. Excuse me, those on Zoom. My cough. We see the Thomas Cole painting from 1836, and next to it a painting by Stephen Hannock called The Oxbow After Church After Cole, flooded, from 1999. That's at the MFA Boston. And so this is a more contemporary painting from only 27 years ago, the same view, but while there are some changes in the view, like the roads, which Hannock actually represents as more like aqueducts, the path of the river is bypassing the Oxbow. It is mostly a nostalgic representation of a pre-industrial landscape, giving a nod to coal even in the title. So I kind of see this vision reinforced. Okay. All right, so I'll transition to the next chapter, which is called Participation in Parcel, Conserving and Experiencing Nature. And this chapter is really about environmental conservation efforts on Mount Holyoke. I mentioned the Mount Holyoke Company that was incorporated in 1908 was really the first kind of community organized group that was rallying around conserving the land on Mount Holyoke. What I'm showing is a map that comes from the Kestrel Land Trust, who has been really active in conserving land in the Mount Holyoke Range and elsewhere in the valley. That you can see it's a really complex patchwork of parcels. It's not all conserved in perpetuity yet, although this map is a bit outdated from 2018. And I mentioned that Skinner kind of negotiated with the park a bit before it finally donated, with the state a bit before it finally donated. It turned into a park in 1940. And I found that the story of environmental conservation really maps onto trends, trends statewide and nationwide with the rise of the environmentalist movement in the 1950s and 60s. And we see a lot of grassroots organizing around several threats to the range over the decades. And then after kind of going through this story, and I'm not, for the purposes of this talk, not really getting into the details of all that, the rest of the chapter talks about perceptions of nature on Mount Holyoke. So I wanted to understand, well, why is it that people rally to advocate for environmental conservation on Mount Holyoke and the Holyoke Range? And I found that people experience and talk about a lot of therapeutic benefits on Mount Holyoke. So experiencing peace and quiet, contemplative thought, and spirituality while on the mountain. And as well as Mount Holyoke is thought of as a place of environmental exceptionality. So people talk about going to see astronomical phenomena like sunsets and moonrises, to observe trees in the fall foliage, to look at the rocks and geological formations, and also to look at birds. I myself became an avid bird watcher through the course of this project. And so I want to quote someone I interviewed named Christine, who is visiting from Springfield. And she said, "I just feel more whole, more complete as a human being at times when I can be in nature and touch dirt and feel the breeze and swat the bug, instead of our artificial human world where those things don't happen." So for Christine and others, Mount Holyoke is seen as a place to be in touch with nature that seems separate and apart from our own neighborhoods and communities. And so the sort of conclusions of this chapter are that Mount Holyoke is special not only because of its unique geology, flora, and fauna, so it does indeed have unique, plant, animal life, and rocks, but what makes the mountain so special is not just that fact, but because of formative experiences, cherished memories, and calm and relaxing feelings that people have on the mountain. That I found in my research that it's more these formative experiences and kind of personal reflections that come out of being in nature that have inspired people and led people to advocate for environmental conservation on the mountain, rather than it just being like having unique geology and flora and fauna. So moving on to the next chapter, which is called Ruin to Museum, Historical Engagement at the Summit House. I characterized 3 different modes of historical engagement specifically at the Summit House. So looking at the Summit House now as a museum as sort of this locus, this center point of engagement with the history. And something I kind of mentioned earlier, a sense of history. So something I'm interested in is not just history itself and telling a history, but trying to understand what is people's sense of history. So how do people understand history, and how do people place themselves into the story of a place? And there's 3 different modes of historical engagement I discovered, and I'm going to delve in a little bit more detail into the preservation side of things, and then talk about collecting and exhibits as well, but dwell a bit on the first one, and being historic preservation advocacy. So community-based grassroots efforts to save the Summit House. So the earliest issue around which preservation advocates rallied was in the 1940s, revolving around saving the tramway. So the roof of the tramway by then had collapsed under a winter of heavy snow, and it was no longer functional. And then there was a grassroots movement that gained a lot of momentum, but ultimately was actually unsuccessful in saving the tramway. It was not reconstructed. What you see here was eventually torn down and is now grown over with trees. So the engine mechanism, which we saw earlier on our walk up, is rusted out, but it is preserved under a roof down the slope from the Summit House. I spoke with many people who interacted with the Summit House when it was in a state of ruin, like Wayne, who remembered walking up along the top of the collapsed tramway roof as a young man. Just like the person in the photo on the left, you can kind of make out a man standing there. In the 1970s, the state proposed tearing down the Summit House completely, citing it as a hazard. And many community members rallied, ultimately convincing the state to invest in refurbishing it and reopening it as a historic site. And I'll share a couple more stories that take place during that time. So that's the one photo I was able to find of the Summit House from the 70s. Gwen Clancy moved back home to South Hadley in 1974 after finishing college. She got a job at UMass making public relations films and had a camera at her disposal. Before she knew of any plans to tear down the Summit House, Gwen made a short, silent film showing a woman walking up to the Summit House and looking out at the view. It was the first film that she ever made. I loved that film, she said. It made me feel so good. It was just all about connection, to a place. The next year, Gwen was approached by the South Hadley Bicentennial Committee to make a second, longer film. At this point, the community heard of the state's plans to tear it down. Gwen produced a short documentary called Summit House. She recorded oral histories from elderly community members and overlaid their audio over video footage and historical photographs. The documentary was soon shown all over the region, including elementary schools, inspiring people to join a growing movement to resist the demolition of the Summit House. A group of citizens formed the Holyoke Range Advisory Committee, which went to Boston to advocate for preservation. Gwen recounted her motivations. If they do tear it down, at least there'll be something so we can remember it. I really didn't think making it would help save the place. That wasn't my intent. I wanted to save the history of it. The Holyoke Range Advisory Committee became a nonprofit. They changed their name to the Friends of the Mount Holyoke Range and remain quite active today. It was through the creation of these first 2 films that Gwen learned her filmmaking skills, leading to a decades-long career as a documentary filmmaker. In 1983, while renovations on the Summit House were underway, she returned to Mount Holyoke and married her husband on the summit. David Gracie was also conducting his own historic investigations into Mount Holyoke. He self-published and self-distributed this book in 1985. Mount Holyoke, An Enduring Prospect, is a key secondary source cited in state reports and almost anything subsequently written about Mount Holyoke. I interviewed David, and he said he interviewed bookmaking as a printer and bookbinder, not as a scholar. He describes himself as a rogue historian. In the 1980s, while renovations were underway, he conducted archival research and dug around the Summit House quite literally, looking for information and objects. David accumulated many artifacts related to Mount Holyoke, like medicine bottles and dishware. He described discovering the dump sites where the hotel proprietors would throw out their trash. And he told me that it was, quote, very interesting stuff. It didn't give you a complete picture, but at least it gave you some sort of background information, what they might have used, which you don't see anywhere and you don't hear anywhere because nobody's going to write down, gee, we had a nice green patterned dish over here. Following this engrossing interpretive experience, David has gone on to self-publish several more books on local history and archaeology. The stories of David Gracie and Gwen Clancy are remarkably similar. They both honed their skills and forged new professional identities through their work at the site. Both engaged in historical investigations without any prior formal training, motivated by a personal desire to learn more about Mount Holyoke and the Summit House. Both produced their first creative work and would go on to dedicate themselves to their respective media and genres. Their works were the first to present the history of Mount Holyoke to a wider audience and had significant impacts on the preservation of the site and continue to be discussed today. I share their two stories to demonstrate the deep level of engagement they had with Mount Holyoke, stimulated by attention to the ruins of the Summit House. So coming back to this slide, the other two modes of engagement that I characterized in the book, other than historic preservation advocacy, as collecting practices and engaging with the exhibits at the Summit House. And I won't go into as much detail on these, but I'll say that for collecting practices, I talked with several people who have their own personal collections of memorabilia and artifacts. And so there's this archive of information at places like Historic Northampton that's available for research, but there's also many families that have their own archives that they curate and add to, acquire materials, and engage with in their homes and even pass down generations to generations. And so that is another, in addition to preservation, collecting is another very active mode of engagement with the history of the site. And in contrast, looking at material inside the Summit House Museum, going on a tour or maybe peeking your head in to look at these tableaus of how like rooms are set up, how they might have been when the building was a hotel, is more of a passive mode of engaging with history. I even talked to people who actually donated objects from their own families to put into the hotel. So the Friends of the Mount Holyoke Range put out a call in the 90s for people to donate antiques so that they could kind of fill up the museum, and that was like a very kind of exciting and active way to participate, but it's a little bit more static now that people kind of just look in and can't really interact in a tactile way. And so as a contemporary ruin, the Summit House offered people the opportunity to engage in activities that foster a strong sense of history. They explored areas not typically allowed, like climbing onto the tramway, the ruins of the tramway or the deck, and were inspired to take on their own historical investigations. Preservation advocates were eventually successful in saving and renovating the structure. However, once the Summit House was refurbished as a historic house museum, its ability to foster a connection to the past and a sense of history actually diminished, I found. The social role of the Mount Holyoke Summit House shifted during its transformation from hotel to ruin, and again from ruin to museum. Visiting the site in its ruined state and engaging in activities such as preservation advocacy and collecting fostered a sense of history, leading to strong attachments to place, much more so than visiting the Summit House as a renovated museum. And kind of my final core thematic chapter is called Materializing Memory on the Mountain, and it's really about engagement with the physical remains, sort of things and objects. And so I talk again about the Summit House, but rather than the previous chapter, talking about the kind of exhibits and saving the structure. This chapter is really about engagement with the wooden material of the Summit House. So looking at different phases of construction and acts of maintenance. So the picture that I'm showing up here, it kind of doesn't look great, and that's because it is in the process of being repainted. So it's going through that phase where kind of it looks worse before it looks better, or it had been sanded down. And I interviewed, painters who were actively repainting the structure. I talked to people who had pieces of the Summit House in their home. So that at one point the deck was redone, and so some people have pieces of the deck. Someone has a table made out of a shutter. And so I think I mentioned that the expansion came down in the hurricane of 1938. Someone's family has kind of used that wood of the structure that came down and kind of building materials on their own home. And so engaging with that materiality, the actual wood of the Summit House was a very active way that fostered engagement to place and really just very rich connections to the mountain. The middle part of this chapter is about the plane crash. So maybe some of you have seen this memorial that's on the summit of Mount Holyoke. In 1944, on a training mission, a plane crashed into the side of the mountain and 10 airmen lost their lives. They were still in training. And so that is a very unlikely landscape of war and of World War II deaths. And so there is also a small exhibit inside the Summit House kind of commemorating this crash. And I delve into that story of kind of what happened from the best of our knowledge, but then how have people understood the crash over time, because it sort of fell out of public memory for quite some time. The memorial wasn't put up until 1989, and the person a couple people sort of rediscovered the crash and led to the creation of this memorial, although I talked to families that sort of never forgot. I haven't found it myself, but there are apparently some still remains of the plane that exist on the mountain. That I talked to some people that have engaged with those ruins. The last part of this chapter on materiality is about the hiking trails, and so I'm thinking about the trails as being these archaeological sites that are rediscovered through the action of every hiker. So if you go off hiking on a trail, you're walking the path that many people have walked before you, even if you don't see them, and you're sort of following in their footsteps and using cues to help find your way. The trail, the blazes that someone painted on the side of the trees, and sort of where, as you hike, you're sort of reinscribing your own story onto the land, kind of over and over again through that process of discovery. So I'm kind of thinking about trails in this way, and my conclusions from this chapter are that engaging with physical things, the objects and materials on Mount Holyoke, really allows for the mountain to remain an active site of memory and recollection. So it's that kind of tactile engagements that are extremely powerful in fostering a sense of place on Mount Holyoke. And so I mentioned at the beginning that my coda is a descent down the slopes of the mountain. And so kind of to conclude, I will just share some of my big picture takeaways. I really hope that readers of the book will approach places that hold personal significance to them with curiosity and renewed perspective. And I want to ask you all a series of questions to consider either Mount Holyoke or another place that is important to you. Why does that place hold such meaning for you? Has your perception of and connection to that place changed over time? What memories do you have there? How do you communicate its importance, the importance of this place to other people? Do you have any shared experiences or memories with others there? What would you do to save the place if it were threatened in some way? And finally, how do you fit into the story of that place? And so just to wrap up, I want to thank the Department of History at the University of Georgia, where I am now based, for supporting and funding this book tour that I've been on for the past few days. I have my schedule up here. This has been the final event. So thank you for being here with me today to kind of celebrate the launch of this book. I want to also thank UMass Amherst for funding the research phase of this project, and the community partners, Friends of the Mount Holyoke Range, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Kestrel Land Trust, for all of your work on the mountain, ongoing work helping conserve and preserve it, but also for talking with me during the research phase of this project. And then I'll lastly sort of reiterate that you can get some books here from Broadside Books that are on site, and I'd be happy to take some formal questions from the audience and then transition into signing if anyone wants a copy signed. So thank you so much for being here. Yes.
I have a question. So, having been to the visitor center in Holyoke, they actually have a kind of exhibit on Summit House. From what I know, there was 3 different Summit Houses that you acquired and getting built. But one of them was much bigger, fancier turrets and stuff. Do you cover the earlier ones, or?
So the question, I think I'll repeat the questions for the benefit of those on Zoom. But the question was about other summit houses and what I cover in the book related to that. I think you referenced a summit house with turrets. There wasn't one with turrets on Mount Holyoke, but there were many other summit houses in the region, including on Mount Tom, right across the river. And the one thing that's so special about the Mount Holyoke Summit House is it's the only one that's actually still standing of this era of summit house construction, and almost all of them have burnt down at some point in time, or were abandoned. There was a summit house on Catskill Mountain in upstate New York that was eventually just torn down by the state, since it wasn't that, it wasn't frequented enough at the time it was taken down by the 60s, I think. So I'm not sure exactly which one with turrets you're referencing, but it might.
Oh, it's a much fancier building than the one that we just saw.
Yeah.
That's there today.
Yeah, so that might be the one on Mount Tom that I think might have burned.
The Erie Ruins.
The Erie Ruins?
Right, that's where the hotel used to be.
Yeah.
There's some remnants there.
Yes. But I guess to also answer your question, I do not cover other summit houses in the book. But that's why I focused on the Mount Holyoke one, since it's kind of special that it's still standing. Yeah. Thank you. Yes?
I noticed in a couple of the pictures that had multiple people in it, primarily women, where they're primarily female visitors here, men just not in the pictures.
Oh, that's okay. So the question is about the gender of the visitors. So it kind of seemed like this photo does.
Yeah, and then you have one later, and again, it's
Yeah. So observation that the photos seem mostly women, because the written resources that I looked at are mostly written by men who have been publishing their memoirs, read as guidebooks, or publishing guidebooks for the region, except for one kind of notable exception, Harriet Martineau, who was, I believe, Scottish, and came and kind of wrote her memoirs. But it would have been men and women visiting. So it was, I don't actually have any kind of data on that, but just it seems like people were coming with kind of partners or alone or families. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
In all your research and reading, did you find any reference to Native American history around and on the mountain?
Yes, thank you. So the question was about reference to Native American history on the mountain. I really appreciate that question. It's not something that I delved into in this talk, but I do have a section in chapter 2, sort of getting into the Native American presence on the mountain. The Mount Holyoke does not seem to be as significant of a site to Native communities as Sugarloaf Mountain or the Great Beaver, but there are kind of references to footpaths, the pre-contact footpaths on the mountain that I decided to not sort of seek out and uncover. But what I primarily talk about in this chapter is how people have talked about Native Americans when recounting the history of Mount Holyoke, to kind of show how that throughout the 1800s has been a quite racist framing. And one sort of story that came out of that was, I didn't really talk at all in this talk, I don't think, about Edward Hitchcock and his relationship to the mountain. He was the president of Amherst College for a time, and he did a lot of work on the mountain. And he, with the graduating Amherst class, they would go around and rename mountains in the valley. And a lot of the Native American names for mountains actually come from Hitchcock and his students wanting to honor, like, kind of, this isn't a direct quote, but quote, honor a lost race and sort of memorialize Native Americans, sort of trying to push this narrative that they are no longer around, even though they were and still are very much around. And so that's mostly the kind of way that I'm incorporating Native American history into the book, is trying to like expose the almost like deliberate erasures that have been perpetuated by the way the story of Mount Holyoke is told. But thank you for that question.
I have two questions. One, in this photograph over on the right, it looks like, is that a steam engine?
Yes.
The smoke going by, sort of a machine in the garden kind of thing. And then the second question I have is about the tramway itself and how it was powered and for how long it worked, and did these people come up on the tramway?
Yeah, so this might, I think this might be a train, because I knew there were train tracks going where the highway is now. So that's what I think that is in the photo, kind of cutting the oxbow like that. The tramway was originally powered by horses. And then, and yes, before it was electrified. And people would have taken a ferry. There was like a whole setup where you could leave Northampton, take a ferry across the river, get a carriage to go to the sort of the tramway, and then take the tramway up. And it used to be open. So in these photos, it's covered. But it used to be open where you could sit with your back to the mountain, kind of look up at the view as you went up, if you could afford it to go up. And then at one point, it was covered, so that the point was that it would like suspend the like wow moment, I guess, and you would come out into the hotel of the lobby and sort of see the view from up there. And I also talked to people, so they would go up and they would go down, and I talked to some people who mentioned that like having, grandparents that worked at the hotel who couldn't afford to go up, but could sometimes get a ride down, because some of the people that paid to go up would want to hike down. And so, but it was really small. You only fit like, I think, around 6 people in the little car to go up. But yeah, in the back is there.
I'm interested in Ms. Clancy's Summit House documentary. Wondering if you were able to see it, and if there's any library staff here, is there a copy here that we can view?
Okay, so the question is about being able to view Gwen Clancy's Summit House documentary. I was able to view it because someone lent me a DVD that I had to give back. And so this would be a great question for Gwen, because I think that there are plans to sort of screen it by the Friends of the Mount Holyoke Range. And I think it would be great to be in touch with Gwen to see if it can be digitized and made more available. But yeah.
How much did it cost to go to the Summit House in like the heyday? For those who can afford it, do you know about? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so around, I think the most, like to eat there, the most expensive meal was like $1.50, something like that.
What's that like?
And I don't know what that would be now. But around like, and at one point the Frenches actually blocked off just to kind of reiterate how like exclusive it was, they at one point blocked off the summit area. So you had to pay even just to get into the area. I don't remember how much, like a quarter or something, and I don't know what that is now, but an entrance fee. No, I don't know how much it costs to stay there at the hotel. But yeah.
In reference to the photograph where you found maybe with steam engines, there was some talk here last week about that industry on the Oxbow, and I think that part of that, those smoke forms are coming from the
The lumber mill.
You know, we found out that actually 300 miles of logs came down from the top of the Connecticut River to that lumber mill. That was finally stopped and were processed there and then sent on trains.
Okay, so,
We saw pictures of it.
okay, great. So the steam is maybe coming from a lumber mill. Can we fact check this?
The sawmill came in 1872.
Okay.
So that, in that picture, the sawmill was operating.
This picture would be when the sawmill was operating? Okay. So that's maybe what that is.
Also, you referred to the Great Beaver. What is that? Was that Sugarloaf?
Yes, so Mount Sugarloaf. Yeah. Yeah.
Is Seymour gonna have to control the whole mountain, or was that just right around the summit house? Can people not hike up on their own?
Yeah, so the Frenches, the question is about clarifying about the summit being blocked off. So as I understand, the Frenches owned most of the mountain, and they sort of blocked off the summit area that was sort of like the resort where there would have been like the bowling alley, and they even had a kind of a telescope or a little observatory, and sort of blocked like access into it. I think people could still get up, but then you had to pay to enter for a time.
Similar question related to class. I know that Mount Tom had become a sort of pleasure grounds for the working class in the late 19th, early 20th century. Was there any effort to open up Mount Holyoke post-Dwight, post-French to a broader audience?
Okay, so the question was opening up Mount Holyoke to a broader audience after kind of the era of the private owners. Yes, and that sort of is linked to the Mount Holyoke Company trying to make it become a public park. So the efforts to sell it to the state were motivated by it becoming available to like anyone and everyone, and they felt that the best way to do that would be for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to own it and to maintain it and to sort of like integrate it into the state park system. And so that was motivated by a desire to sort of just open it up to everyone, and folks at the time sort of hoped that the hotel would remain operating, so that wasn't part of the plan of the state, but I think that was guiding that desire to make it a state park. And they didn't want to do it themselves because they just kind of couldn't afford the maintenance.
So there's a restaurant in South Hadley Center on the corner of Route 116 and 47 called, I think, Yard Tavern or something. And inside they have lots of pictures of this area, which are great to see. One of which is the ferry that was mentioned. And the ferry came from where Gleason Brothers is, the stables, and the horse and carriage would be put on a barge, and then it was pulled across by ropes.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was the ferry to get over and then drive up to the Summit House and then take the tramway up.
Yeah. Yeah, so the comment was about seeing an archival photograph in a restaurant and seeing kind of the horses actually pulling ferries across the river to make it on this journey.
Okay, this isn't a question. This is, I actually got married at the Southern House on the porch in 1981. And there were about 100 people on the porch. And the day before, we called the administrator to say, is it safe? And he said, sure, no problem. And then following it, about a week later, big front page of the Gazette saying, there is only one bolt holding on to the porch.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, so someone in the audience shared that she got married up on the Summit House. Was it 1981, you said? And actually, you referenced the one bolt holding up the Summit House. I spoke to a lot of people who talk about the one bolt that was holding it up, as well as people that kind of went into the basement of the Summit House, because in the basement, it's literally built on the mountain. You can see in this photograph. So the basement isn't like a flat ground, so you have to like climb up and down rocks, and apparently that's where the bolt was, and sort of adds to this exceptionality that it didn't get blown off the side of the mountain, and then it didn't burn down either, so that's also pretty special. I think now it has a sprinkler system that was installed more recently, but to help with that.
You mentioned that part of the reason that it became less popular is because people started having their own car. And that just reminded me of the Catskills and those resorts and the fact that they've taken away because of that. Was there as much of a party life as I think there was in the Catskills, or was this more of a place to go for peace and tranquility?
Okay, great. So there's a comment about sort of the Catskill resorts also declining in visitorship because of the increase of cars, and a question about it being, was there a party life or being about peace and tranquility? And so what I've read is that the kind of earlier cabin that was up there before they built the luxury hotel was more of a party scene. And I'm not going to remember the direct quote, but there's a quote of like, it's a go up with the boys and get away from the ladies and get a drink type of vibe. Play cards and things like that. And so that was sort of a guy's scene, party scene, I think. But then when they built the hotel, it does seem more of a peace, calm, like family-oriented type of thing. But yeah, and then even in the cabin, I think they served like ginger beer and some snacks, and so people would go up and have their snacks and stuff before they came down. But yeah, it became, with the rise of kind of cars and also the increase of just outdoor recreation, like hiking becoming a pastime. You know, they just kind of want to hike and down, and that's like the activity rather than being carried all the way up and then sitting there and spending a week looking out at the view. So this shifted, but thank you. Okay, so the question is if Jenny Lind actually sang there. Jenny Lind being a Swedish, I think, opera singer who came to the Summit House. I don't think she sang there. I don't even think she spent the night there. I think she just came and visited and left. And also Abraham Lincoln did not stay here, although someone had forged his signature in the guest book. And people kept talking about Lincoln visiting there, I think, as recently as almost 20 years ago, and it's finally like, that was a forgery, so Lincoln did not come up here. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Congratulations, young lady, for getting your doctorate, a job, and writing this incredible book.
Thank you.
That's absolutely fantastic to be able to do that. When it comes to presidents, it's very ironic that we are in the very room that celebrates Calvin Coolidge as President of the United States. As far as we know, he is the only one that actually got to come out.
Yeah.
And that's amazing to think that he is the only president. When Coolidge was vice president, we brought Harding here, but the two of them decided they were going to Montana rather than Mount Holyoke. So some people say McKinley, but that's not, seems like it's not an improvement for that part of it either. So Calvin Coolidge, being here today, pretty cool to realize that. If I were to comment on a couple of other things, the Red Clancy film is shown at the Notch Visiting Center periodically, and right now in South Hadley, on the South Hadley channel, they are actually showing, and they do it periodically on the South Hadley channel. And Gwen is supposedly going to do an update on some of that too. If I could get you to go back to a picture that you had of a drawing of the Mountain House. I sent you a letter that I'm hoping that you received on Wayne Buckell,
I did not.
and if you've not received it, you will.
Okay.
It's not that pointed, it's the poster drawing.
Oh,
There are two pictures on the same.
this one?
There you go. That's it. So, on the right, you will see what my wife Sandy and Sandy found this poster for us about 15 years ago, and we had no idea what this was. I happened to have grown up on the side of Mount Holyoke, and had never seen this drawing, never saw the picture or anything. That road is some
Yeah, thanks so much, Wayne. One of the people I interview in the book and referenced today in the talk, so thank you. And I look out for your letter. Just to also reiterate, so you mentioned too that Calvin Coolidge, we're in the Calvin Coolidge Museum right now, was the only president to visit the Summit House. And also that Gwen Clancy's film is being shown at the Notch Visitor Center and then sometimes on TV, right? So that folks, South Hadley, so that people on Zoom can catch that. And then she will be doing a program soon. I think, but yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
I don't know how to articulate my question, but maybe you can just use what I say. I'm intrigued by the relationship to place that you bring up, like in the past, and also like the people that you interviewed in the present. And just curious if you found any themes or like grand conclusions. You sort of talked about this, but like about like what is it? Because I feel like the fancy people maybe have like an attachment to this place because they could like ride the tram up and like have a cocktail or something. But then there's like people who maybe have no acknowledgement of that history at all that have something. So is it like the rock? Is it the building? Is it the view? And like what does it mean to have a relationship to place across time, and how does that vary based on like class, life experience, identity?
Yeah, thank you. So the question was to expand on the concept of place attachment and what does that mean, especially for people in the present. It's the concise version of your question, but thank you. Yeah, so I think it is really different for different people, and I think that's what I kind of tried to structure the book in terms of like different ways that people do foster a sense of place and place attachment, and that really varies depending on if people sort of engage with the Summit House as a ruin and we're around then, that is really like one active route. But I think more in the present, since now it is a renovated historic house museum, the sort of most active ways people form attachments to place are through hiking on the trails. And engaging like all of their senses while on the mountain. And then sort of that leading to the environmental conservation, which I would say is sort of the most active way that people are sort of enacting and mobilizing around that sense of space. But I think, yeah, it's sort of looking at the landscape and engaging with the environment is really the most active modes like in the present.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you, everybody.